Hello, welcome to Judaism as a Liberation Theology, Sinai and Jewish Peoplehood. My name is Yoshi Silverstein. Thank you so much for tuning in to this session. A little roadmap of where we are headed. We're going to start off giving a little overview, a brief history of Jewish liberation from Exodus to Revelation. I'm not going to go over the entire several thousand years of the past, just take a brief look at that 7-week period. We'll look at conceptions of Jewish peoplehood, thinking about some of the different ways in which we define the boundaries of our community. And then we will finish off by exploring some ideas about Jewish liberation theology, what it could be, what it is, and what it could be in the future. About me, like I said, my name is Yoshi Silverstein. I am a Chinese Ashkenazi American Jew. I grew up in the inland Northwest in Spokane, Washington. I am the founder and executive director of Mitsui Collective, which is a new startup based here in Cleveland, also with a national reach. Our mission is to build resilient community through embodied Jewish practice with a multiracial justice lens. A little bit about where I am coming from, since you're sitting here learning from me for the next little while. Most recently, I was director of the Jaffe Fellowship at Chazon. Chazon is the Jewish Lab for Sustainability, and Jaffe stands for Jewish Outdoor Food Farming and Environmental Education. Before that, I spent time at the Pearlstone Center, at the Teva Center, here in the Cleveland area at Camp Wise for a couple summers, which is also where I met my wife. And I've also studied at Pardes, at Brandeis University, Kibbutz Latan, Hebrew University, as well as secular studies at the universities of Idaho and Maryland. My areas of work and study have been in Jewish nature education, in movement and wellness practices, in diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and in landscape design. So with that, we'll jump on in. A brief history of Jewish liberation. We're going to talk about the time period of Exodus, which we commemorate in the holiday of Passover, of Pesach, to Revelation, the holiday of Shavuot that is here upon us as you're watching this video. You can see here on this slide there's a couple different ways of understanding this period. One is sort of a linear understanding. So on the left-hand side of the slide you can see Passover, you can see the 7 weeks of the Omer. We are, as I record this, we're in day 36 of the Omer, so we have just started the 6th week, the penultimate week of the Omer. So 49 days of Omer that culminate in the holiday of Shavuot. The two main ways in which we understand this period. One is the sort of historical understanding of commemorating the exodus from Egypt, from Passover, the time in the wilderness that's represented by the Omer, which is a particularly apt metaphor right now as all of us are sort of in this time of ambiguity and uncertainty during the wilderness, so to speak, of coronavirus. And that then culminates in receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. Agriculturally, then, if we fast forward to the time of living in ancient Israel, this also refers to the barley harvest. So Omer translates literally to a bundle of barley, and so this is also the time in which we would be bundling up and gathering and counting the harvest and getting a sense of whether this would be a good crop year or not so good of a crop year. And then in Shavuot, which is the second of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, folks would then take their harvest to the temple in Jerusalem. So there's 2 ways of understanding that. And then the final way is to sort of think not necessarily linearly, but of course in Jewish time as a cycle. So you can see here this graphic from Yigal Deutscher of the Seven Seas Project that lays out the entire cycle of the Hebrew calendar, starting with the week in the centermost circle, going out to then the months and then to the full year-long cycle. And this part here that is bolded or is highlighted is this stretch that we're in right here. So Pesach, Passover, starts there in what is also noted as East or Mizrach, which is the start of the year, and then continues through the end to Shavuot. So we're going about, what is that? About a little less than a quarter of the way through the year. So some really just interesting things to note in terms of how this becomes a moment of Jewish liberation. Before this time, you could characterize the Jewish people not even as a people, but as this band of tribes who descended directly from the tribe of Abraham. And this time that we commemorate of Passover is really what some call the birth of the Israelite nation. And this is really the time where we become a full people. Before that, again, we were a band of tribes. This is where we really become a full nation in this moment of liberation from slavery in Egypt to becoming free in the wilderness on our way towards having a home of our own. So as we think about what that means to have become a Jewish nation, to become a Jewish people, there's some different ways that we should think about how we characterize what that means to be a Jewish people. You can see here this list of some of the different ways in which we commonly think about Jewish peoplehood. The first is that definition of the tribal bloodline, that we can genetically trace ourselves back to our patriarchs, to Abraham and of course to Sarah and to Isaac and Jacob. Certainly that is one of the through lines that goes through Jewish peoplehood. We can also think about Jewish peoplehood as a religious identity in which to be Jewish is to practice the Jewish religion. We can think about it as an ethnic identity. This is, of course, closely related to the tribal bloodline identity. We can think about it culturally, we can think about it politically, and then we can also talk about it in some of these ways that are still important but somewhat less tangible. So values-based. Jewish people share a certain set of values, and that's part of what brings us together as a people. We can talk about the Jewish community, again, an important if somewhat fuzzy characterization. Or we could talk about Judaism as a way of life, whether that's religious or cultural or any of the above. I think probably most of us hold some combination of these things and probably don't view it as only one or the other, but think about it as a complementary suite of all of these things. So these become important because when we think about what it means to be part of the Jewish people, we then think about, okay, if we are a people, then we have to think about what does that mean? How do we define that, and how do we define its boundaries? Priya Parker, who's the author of The Art of Gathering, talks about gathering, which is another way to talk about the ways in which a community comes together to gather. So she talks about gatherings that are meaningful and purposeful as having a meaningful, disputable purpose, right? So if you are going to a gathering, it becomes meaningful because you've chosen to go there, you know what you're getting into, and there's something about that that is distinct from anything else that you could be doing at that time. You're choosing to join the other people in that gathering. So if we think about what is the purpose of Jewish peoplehood, we think then what are the boundaries that create a distinct container for Jewish peoplehood. And then we think about how do we characterize or define those boundaries. So are they fixed or flexible? Are they something that changes over time or it's immutable? It doesn't change. Are they hard, meaning you can't penetrate very easily, or is there a level of porosity that allows for interchange between the outside of that boundary and the inside? So these are really important questions when you think about Jewish peoplehood. And then finally, if we think about who we are as a people, we think about then what is our relationship to other peoples and communities, and what characterizes those relationships. Are they competitive or collaborative? Do we relate to these other peoples and communities from a state of opposition or from a position of solidarity? And finally, to think about the power dynamics that come into play. Are we thinking about an oppressive relationship or a liberatory relationship? And those things can be in one direction or they can be multi-directional in all of those different instances. So as we continue to dive into thinking about what it means to be a Jewish people, one of the things we can think about is what does diversity look like alongside the Jewish people? And here we again go back to Exodus and think about this concept or this term called the Erev Rav, which translates directly to the mixed multitude. Erev is mixed, Rav is like a greatness, so the mixed multitude. There's different ways of understanding who the Erev are and were. Rabbi Dr. Gail Leibovitz describes them as others who were oppressed by the Egyptian system of feudalism and slavery, who took the exodus of the Israelites as a chance to also liberate themselves. So basically you have all of these other folks who may have been enslaved or who were part of this feudal system from any number of different places in the region. They saw what was going on with the Israelites. They saw this liberatory movement, and they said, hey, that looks great. These folks are taking this chance to get out of here. We are going to hop on board the liberation train and liberate ourselves alongside them. So that's one way of understanding who these people are from sort of just a literal standpoint. But then how do we characterize these folks? And here's where we have a little bit of disagreement and some controversy that arises. So the most common historical and theological understanding of the Erev Rav is that these folks are actually a pretty negative presence, that they're a source of trouble and discord. One of the ways in which we get to that is from the arov, which comes from that same root as Erev, which translates to the insect swarms or the wild beast. So definitely these things that don't have great connotations. And so in that line of thinking, the Erev Rav are blamed for everything from the golden calf to all of the problems that beset the people Israel, and are even talked about today as to go even to the extreme that the Erev Rav are what lies between us and the coming of the Messiah. So pretty heavy negative associations with the Erev Rav. But there are some other associations as well. So in Eitz Chaim, in the Chumash, they talk about three different groups of Egyptians. And the first group is the group that were the folks who enslaved the Israelites, and clearly did not think highly of the Israelites, and they were the ones actively oppressing the Israelites as slaves. The second group are folks that neither directly enslaved the Israelites, nor did they particularly work to help them. And when the Israelites left, they kind of viewed them as, well, that's just inconvenient. And then finally, this third group of Egyptians, the Eitz Chaim talks about as actually celebrating the Pesach and the Exodus with Israel, and then who left with them. So that's another way to understand the Erev Rav. And we also have this understanding from Midrash that talks about them as kasherim, as the proper ones. And in this case, Erev Rav actually gets the highest praise of all of these different groups that are being discussed. So when we're thinking about Erev Rav, again, in Jewish tradition and theology, as usual, there's a lot of different ways to think about and understand, and in some cases maybe reimagine or redefine what some of these different terms mean. So we can also think about Erev as in the evening, and Ma'ariv, which are the evening prayers, which happen during this time in the twilight, when the twilight sky is blending. If you think about that time in the late evening when we recite the Ma'ariv prayers, it's this time when the sun has gone down, evening is coming, but it's not full nighttime, so there's sort of a beautiful blend of different colors in the sky. So that's Ma'ariv, which again references this idea of Me'orev, of the mixing or the blending. We can also think about Erev in the context of Eruv, which is, here Jastra talks about as a magic string that surrounds a neighborhood to create a symbolic community of residence or continuity of action. So again, the Eruv is literally a string that's placed, that creates a boundary around an area that allows for certain aspects of Shabbat that you're allowed to do, and sort of extends the boundary of what's considered part of your home. And so if we think about Erev and Erev Rav in this context of Eruv, and we're thinking about what does it mean then, how do we create the boundaries between what and who are considered part of our community, right? And what is, again, the hardness or the flexibility of that boundary? Is there porosity? Is there space for folks to be in community with us, even if they may or may not necessarily be considered directly part of the Jewish people? So next, we look at diversity within the Jewish people. And one of the first things that we do after the Exodus is we count. It makes sense. We wanted to see, okay, who's with us, right? Anytime you go on an expedition or some sort of journey, you do a head count. It's even just from a practical standpoint to make sure you don't lose anybody, but you want to get a sense of who's a part of the community. So one of the first things that we did is we did a census. We did this in the book of Exodus. We did it right after leaving Egypt. We did it at Sinai before we then began the journey into the wilderness. And again, we're considering who is part of the community. In Exodus, we count 600,000 men on foot, which is sort of the defining characteristic of the people who are counted. In Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, The men 20 years and older who were able to bear arms were counted, and the Torah says we found a total of 603,550 Israelites who were found fit for military service, which makes sense given that we were about to go into this journey into the wilderness. It's worth noting that Levites as a tribe were not included in that count, nor were women, and nor were the Erev Rav. So again, this question of who do we consider part of the community or folks that are just going alongside us. So this question of who counts in Jewish community is really important. I think hopefully in this day and age, most of us would agree that if you're not counting women as part of the community, you're missing a pretty sizable portion of who the community is. And if you're not counting them, the representation is both the representation and the power and influence and say in things is not going to be what it should be. A lot of us, though, are not as used to thinking about what racial and ethnic diversity looks like in the Jewish community. So here I want to talk about this term, Jews of color, and sometimes we include folks of indigenous Sephardi and Mizrahi heritage as part of that term. In recent studies have found that a minimum of 12 to 15% of the U.S. Jewish population are people of color. That's definitely higher in certain areas of the country, and likely that is a low count, and in general that number across the board is higher. So when we're talking about Jews of color, we're talking about folks who identify as people of color, folks who identify as non-white. There's different ways to sort of think about and cut that. The study that I'm referencing, which was conducted by the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative, was using the U.S. Census categories of race to look at who is considered a person of color in the Jewish community. So 12 to 15%, and again, that's a minimum count. That means 1 out of every 7 Jews in the United States is a person of color. And if there are roughly 7 million Jews in the U.S., and again, that number has some debate in terms of what that actual number is, but one of the numbers that folks say is 7 million for the U.S. Jewish population. 1 out of every 7 means there are 1 million Jews of color currently living in the United States. And yet, when we think about the typical Jewish community that we see when we're part of different Jewish experiences, when we go to things at different Jewish institutions, when we think about who is part of our community, I'm willing to bet that the numbers that you see when you look around do not reflect anywhere near the actual numbers of the reality. And so we are then, I think we're compelled to ask, if we know that the data says that these are the numbers of folks who are in the United States living as Jews, why don't we see them in our communities? What can we be doing to create more welcoming, more inclusive, more representative communities that reflect the actual state of what things look like? The other thing I just want to note is we talked about the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude, and there's a machloket. There's a bit of a disagreement about the extent to which we should be talking about the Erev Rav in the context of Jews of color. Some folks, because of the negative associations, say we should keep as far away as possible with associating with the Erev Rav and Jews of color, and others use this term frequently to talk about the fact that from the very beginning of who we were as a Jewish people, we had other groups that extended beyond the tribal bloodline that became ultimately part of our people. We were a mixed multitude. We were racially diverse from the very start, and that's always been part of who we are as the Jewish people. So this brings us to the final portion of our session, which is to explore this concept of liberation theology and to think about, if we are this diverse, multiracial people, then what does that mean our role? What does that mean for our role in the broader world, and how we understand the purpose of Judaism and the purpose of the Jewish people? So briefly, the roots and origins of liberation theology. It's a movement originating out of Roman Catholicism in Latin America. It interprets the Gospels through the lived experiences of oppressed people and focuses on the reorganizing of social, governmental, and economic structures so that the poor are not merely cared for, but are brought into the fullness of human flourishing. It really centers the experience and needs of the oppressed, and focuses on this question of how do we fully liberate those around the world who are in a state of oppression. The seminal defining work is from Dominican Father Gustavo Gutierrez, who wrote in 1971 a Theology of Liberation. And since then, it's spread in different ways into the sort of somewhat more secular world of public health. Paul Farmer, who is a major figure, talks about liberation theology as it applies to public health, talking about structural violence and inequities, and how do we consider those when we're addressing the conditions that create unequal outcomes for the rich and poor. Starting in, I believe, the 80s, and I should say here, I am by no means an expert on liberation theology, but in terms of the overview, a lot of black communities also really started to take hold of liberation theology and thinking about it specifically in the context of racial justice, particularly in the United States and in South Africa, but in general around the world, and especially for Christian black communities to trace back to this time of the Exodus from what Christians understand as the Old Testament, and this period of liberation. And so a lot of black liberation theology in particular references this time of Exodus and Revelation. It's also worth noting that the Palestinian people have also taken on a thread of liberation theology, and it's become a pretty central part of the Palestinian self-determination, and don't want to go too deep into that at this moment, but I think it's important to understand that that there are groups of people who have really taken on this question of what does it mean for folks who are in conditions that are oppressive to find full liberation. So that brings us to our final topic, which is to think about what a Jewish liberation theology might mean and might look like. So the first component of thinking about this idea is to think about what this means within the context of solidarity. So Ed Asner talks about liberation theology as engaging our spirituality in relation to our willingness to liberate people worldwide: children, the sick, the hungry, the oppressed, etc. He says the meat of this question is Hillel's second question: if I am only for myself, what am I? We have in our texts, which appears here in Exodus 23, verse 9, "You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt." And in fact, this phrase, this reminder that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, comes about in the Torah 36 times. It is the most commonly repeated phrase of anything in the Torah. So clearly the Torah wants to emphasize that we remember what it was like to be an oppressed people, to be slaves in the land of Egypt. And so on one level, thinking about Jewish liberation theology is to think, what does it mean for us to remember that state of ger, that state of otherness, that state of oppression, and how do we think about being in solidarity with other groups who are currently oppressed? We can think about the stages of liberation in terms of how do we then activate a liberation theology. From Rabbi Toba Spitzer talks about these stages of liberation, again referencing the period from Exodus to Sinai. We were taken out of bondage. So just the physical removal of that. We were delivered from, we became free. We had the redemption, and then the taken to the embrace of the possibility of becoming, to moving towards a place of liberation. So some core questions come about when we think about a Jewish liberation theology. One is, what does it mean to have liberation of the other, both within Jewish community as well as beyond Jewish community? Who is considered the other, or who gets othered by the ways in which we define the boundaries of community and the ways in which we practice? What are the implications of Jewish peoplehood and how we view the core purpose of modern Judaism in the larger context of history and contemporary challenges? I think it's important to note that there are clear racial dynamics at play in liberation theology. It's not the only factor, but the pervasiveness of racism makes it a particularly important factor anytime we're talking about oppression and liberation. I think we should think about what it means to have a deeper understanding of tikkun olam. Tikkun olam is this phrase that is kind of everywhere now. Anytime in Jewish community when we talk about doing good things, often you'll see tikkun olam as being part of that. But how do we think about it in a deeper sense than just social justice, but thinking about what does it really mean to have a theology of liberation, a theology of making tikkun, of rectifying the things that have been broken in the world? How do we put that into practice so that it becomes actual action and not just talk? Finally, we're in this time of social isolation in the time of coronavirus. And this is a particularly relevant time to think about what does it mean to think about liberation, both in the sense of, I think we're all yearning for the literal liberation of being isolated and being sort of stuck in wherever we've been sheltering in place. But it's also important to recognize that coronavirus already has impacted different groups in different ways, particularly people of color, and especially the Black community has been more heavily impacted by coronavirus. And that's going to be true as we move out of this state as well. The rate of change in terms of getting into a better place is going to be different for different communities, and we really need to remember that. So this is an exploration. This is not an area of expertise for me, and I'm not about to write a book on this, but in lieu of having an in-person discussion, I wanted to take this opportunity to present some of these different ideas. And so it's an exploration. I think this is the beginning of the conversation and a continuation of it, but some of the characteristics that feel particularly important for me to really center at the root of what a Jewish liberation theology would look like. One is this care for the disenfranchised. We have what we sometimes call the agricultural tzedakah program, in which in ancient Israel we had different commandments that referred to taking care of the poor. So we had Peah, which is marking the corners of your field for the poor and the widowed and the orphaned to be able to gather. We have laws like Ma'aser, which is donating a tenth of your produce, of your harvest, to the poor. So keeping those disenfranchised in mind is really critical to thinking about this liberation theology. Secondly, to think about what does it mean to have a diverse Jewish community, again, the idea of peoplehood, and that we base this on covenant, that we base this on folks committing to the social contract of the Jewish peoplehood as the most important factor of how we define community. And I would say over faith or bloodline exclusively. I'm not saying we shouldn't consider those, but that those should not themselves be the most important variable. We think about Jewish people as existing in diaspora. We're spread across the world. And what does it mean to have that relationality globally? And finally, what does it mean to be in solidarity? To consider this idea that we are all bound up in the universal liberation of not only ourselves, but of all people around the world. And we are not free until all are free. Finally, I want to thank everyone who is watching this now, and all of the teachers and thought leaders who have been blessed to have the chance to learn with. You can see some of them listed here. And I invite anyone, again, to be in touch. I would love to continue this conversation. You can see my contact here. You can go to the website, mitsuicollective.org, and you can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. With that, I want to say Chag Sameach, a happy holiday. May all of us find a place of revelation and discovery of our own personal Torah during this challenging time. Thanks so much.